Morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Just as the launching of the WTO Doha round reached its 10th anniversary in 2011, the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization convened a group of distinguished trade policy experts. Sorry, I apologize. I'm having some difficulties. So I am very pleased to be part of this event on the future of trade policy. I am even more pleased because I am in this session in the good company of a group of high caliber trade economists whom I very much appreciate, including as co-chair of the session, my dear friend, Patrick Messerlin, and a mentor of mine and many, many others on trade and development, the admired Anne Krueger. The last time Anne, Patrick, and I were together at a meeting, actually with Bernard Hopkins too, was almost a decade ago, when we and others working on trade and development, including some other participants at this forum, at this conference, got together at Yale actually to discuss, generally speaking, the topic of this forum. We wanted to discuss the critical issues and circumstances faced by the international trading system. And with this excuse, we wish to celebrate the admirable career of Patrick as he was retiring from his long-held professorship of international economics at SANSPO. Notwithstanding the opportunity of seeing so many friends to celebrate Patrick, my recollection is that when we got down to talk about our subject, the mood became rather somber. We were affected by the failure to conclude the Doha round after 10 years of its launching. And this failure, despite the solemn commitment that the G20 leaders had made as a reaction to the outbreak of the Great Crisis. We were also concerned about the long march to fragmentation of the trading system caused by the proliferation of regional trade agreements that had transpired over the previous decade. We were taking very seriously Simon Evenen's report, another participant at this forum, that contrary to the pledges made by the G20 to reject protectionism and boost global trade, the world was actually enduring creeping protectionism. In short, we were very worried about the consequences in terms of lost economic opportunities, of failing to reform and strengthen the system as had been repeatedly pledged in vain by the key global players. Frankly, after everything that has happened in recent years, I am tempted to think with nostalgia about the circumstances prevailing in 2011 that made us gloomy back then. Now, those circumstances look in retrospect like a happy time, simply because none of us, however worried we were, could seriously entertain an imminent existential threat for the trading system, and least of all, that the chief culprit, although not the only one, of that threat would be the United States. So here we are, looking again at the future of trade policy, but not in light of the reform laziness that prevailed throughout the first decade and a half of the century, but actually looking at a system that has been cracking as a result of the violation of its rules, enduring a trade war between two great powers, and suffering the indifference of other stakeholders. So this is really the motivation of this session. Trade policy and trade wars back to the past. To introduce the session better than me and to present our panelists, I give the floor to my good friend, Patrick Messerlin. You are in mute, Patrick. Unmute.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words, Ernesto. It has always been a pleasure to work with you, and to see you again is, of course, double pleasure. I did not deserve your kind words because I have left the trade field like a traitor and a coward, and take a refugee position in cultural industry is a completely different topic, although there are many trade issues. And I would like also to use this opportunity to thank again Anne Krueger. A long time ago, she went to a very remote suburban Parisian university and took time, despite her heavy schedule, to talk about the what everybody should know on international trade. By the way, this is the title of the book that she will publish a few days now. And of course, I would like to thank very much Bernard Hockman and André Sapir, Sebastien Jean, and Craig Vangrasstek, I never know how to say your name, for many discussion and interesting work to do together. As stressed by Ernesto, this is a traumatic time. What can we do? Simply, what can we do? 2 or 3 decades ago, we knew that we had to work about better rules, and we work a lot about better rules. A decade ago, we knew that we had to work on how to work with suboptimal rules, preferential trade agreements and all the others. But today we face a constraint that I think we never seriously considered. World health of state and of government that's simply not fit to the job. And too many world politicians like that at the same time, and too much moved by the rage of destruction. And that's really very different. Certainly one thing to do, but all of you are doing that, it's certainly to document all their inconsistencies, their lies, and to predict the failure of these policies and these politicians. The cost is enormous. We don't know when it will be paid and how long it will take to pay, but the cost is really important. But this task to really follow the heads of state and governments is really important. People say, this is the people are unhappy. I can really understand the Americans or the British who are unhappy about the diminishing giant syndrome of the own country. We French went through the same process 30, 40 years ago. But the problem is that we got the luck to have politicians who were able to help the people to go through this process. And when I was thinking about that this morning, I was thinking about how Europe will be if in the 50s, after the collapse of the economies and the values and all this stuff in Europe, imagine Donald Trump instead of General George Marshall and Boris Johnson instead of Churchill. This is where we are. And how can you do is that? We are in some sense in a very difficult position because of that. That said, I cannot go further because, as I said, I left the field a long time ago, and I think we should better, if you allow me, Ernesto, to give the floor to the panelists to have these views about what to do, what can we do, in which direction should we work, and so, if I may, could I give the floor to the panelists, Ernesto?
Yes, and let us give the word first to Anne Krueger.
Yeah, of course.
You are in mute, Anne. Unmute.
Okay, that okay?
Yeah, that's
perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. You said you were happy to be here. I think this is an unhappy occasion, given what's happening to the trading system. So it's hard to be happy, but it's a pleasure to see everybody. I wanted to start by sort of talking about what did happen a little bit as we move toward the current situation and how important trade is and how much I think the world benefited by it, because I think it's important to remember that, because I think that limits the extent to which this integration can start or can continue for too long. And so I will end sort of in being pessimistic in the short run, but more optimistic in the longer run. So starting with the short run, we have a history in which the world became increasingly open to trade, increasingly liberalized, removing quantitative restrictions to trade, lowering tariffs, both on manufacturers at least, even cutting some barriers to services. It's beginning to do things to get agricultural trade more sorted out. And more countries joined in the movement because they saw what the benefits were of doing so. I like to think of the example of South America, where all South American countries, with virtually no exception, were extremely protectionist, extremely oriented toward import substitution in the 1950s and 1960s, and even the 1970s. They had some growth after the Second World War, which was, I think of as bounce back rather than growth. But then what should have been a high growth rate either stagnated or became a low one. Then along came Chile, around about the late 1970s, and policies there changed. And Chile, which had been one of the worst performers with copper exports and nitrates and a few other things, had very low growth, very high inflation. And lo and behold, within 5 years, the economy was drastically changed for the better, according to everybody. That meant that other countries where people were pushing for protection meant more resistance, more people recognized the benefits of open trade. So it was not only the WTO that did it, it was the example that then got set, which was very important, I think, in what happened up until this last decade. I'm afraid that one thing that happened was that everybody got used to the open system and took it for granted, just like they take breathing air for granted, despite increasing pollution. And I think that's a problem, that the people do not benefit or do not recognize the benefits, whereas people who once saw no variety of goods on the consumer shelves and things like that did appreciate what had happened when they opened up. With that, we moved along until 2017. And I think one thing that's important about that, sorry about this. One thing that's important about that is that even with the worldwide recession, there was very little protectionist pressure relative to what had been expected with that in 2007, 2008. We still had less move to protection than we normally had in time because it was appreciated. One part of that was important, however, was US leadership. I was always very proud of the role my country took after World War II. Instead of going for reparations and vengeance, we went for building a better world. We did so. We created the GATT, which of course became the WTO, and pushed for a greater trade liberalization along the way. We started out as a fairly open economy after the Second World War, and we kept our tariffs low and even lowered them further. Until 1986, the United States did not even enter into any meaningful preferential trade arrangement. There was one free trade agreement with Israel, but I'll ignore that, and a couple other little things, but leaving that aside, it was really in the late 1980s that the beginning of a split became between those who were just open completely with no discrimination, as the WTO requires, and those who entered into free trade agreements and then lowered their barriers to countries that were members more than others. And of course, the US changed with NAFTA completely in that regard, but still maintained its posture as an open trading country and had very low tariffs, not averaging more than 3 or 4% on manufactured goods. And even in agriculture, restriction was not as high as it had been lowered for a variety of reasons. What then happened, of course, was that we got a new administration in the United States, which really did not buy into any of the things that most of us had learned the hard way in the preceding time since World War II, and indeed stopped not only advocating more open system, but went further than that and began reversing US policies, even violating WTO as it now is law in doing so, and basically thumbing its nose at the system, and as Ernesto said, starting a trade war with China, which certainly is a highly undesirable thing. And if the US had objections, it would have been much better off and much better advised and gotten more if it had gone more through the WTO. However, it would not have gotten everything, and they wanted everything. And basically, the president, I think, gambled that US economic power was enough to make all other countries go along. There was some truth to it, of course, but not as much as to make it worthwhile. And Americans are clearly, in my view, worse off already because of what has happened and will continue to be so if this continues. So the if this continues is what the subject of our conversation is. What is going to happen next? In the short run, I have no doubt that we have more restriction than we had. It's a sad event, but there are all kinds of businesses, consumer groups, and others who are basically wounded by this, including even some of those who are supposedly the beneficiaries of protection. I have in mind the aluminum workers and the aluminum companies in the United States, which objected last week when the Trump administration again did impose tariffs on aluminum imports. Even the industry itself does not want them. And yet the Trump administration did it. But having said that, there are some countries that recognize what's happening and going wrong and working, first off, to try and revive the WTO, which of course is difficult without the largest member, one of the two largest members, being at the table in a constructive way. But they are also working in other ways to try and maintain openness. And in the short run, I think that the preferential trading arrangements will probably be strengthened in many cases, and maybe even enlarged, both in terms of membership and in terms of scope of coverage. Some countries, of course, may remain somewhat more protectionist and not do so, being isolated. And the other trouble, of course, is that in many countries, the protectionists have been given extra backbone by the argument that, well, look, even the United States is doing it, or even the world is becoming more protectionist. We have to guard against it. I think that argument is wrong. And I think it is wrong because those countries that remain open to trade are the countries that are going to fare better over the intermediate and the longer term. Among other things, we talk about comparative advantage, which is quite clearly important for trade, but there's also competition. And competition is very important, I think, for the structure of domestic industries everywhere. And companies that do not face as much competition do more poorly. And there are all kinds of examples of cases opening up where countries then discovered they had competitive industries which earlier had been high cost, low quality. So there is scope from the past to believe that that will happen again. And that some countries at least will keep an open path and do better. As they do better, my hope would be that other countries would come along, recognize the mistakes that have been in the past, and revive the open trading system, including taking on some of the new and difficult issues which have been ignored over the past 15 or 20 years. And of course, I have in mind e-commerce, cybersecurity, and those kinds of things. I think they need a lot of attention. I do not think that they are getting it now. They can't get it now given the situation. And I think that at least is part of the future. Given my time limit, I'll stop there, but I think over the longer term, once we get to a point where enough countries have recognized the benefits of trade, those who are left out will clamor to join and will have done poorly enough so that the sentiment will shift back toward an open, multilateral, non-discriminatory system. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for such an excellent presentation. Now we'll ask if you agree, Patrick, Craig, to take the floor.
Okay, gracias, señor presidente. Merci, Patrick. I will pick up some of the themes I think that have already been touched upon, but I'll be doing it from a somewhat different perspective. Being a political scientist, I think about the role of power in the system. And I agree that we are in a very difficult position right now in the world trading system. I agree that we face a crisis. I think, however, that we would be mistaken to believe that it's a crisis of the moment. I think that a lot of the problem that some people have in looking at the world today is to say, we have a name for this problem, and this name is Trump. And if we did away with Donald Trump and the United States were to restore its leadership from the past, the problems would disappear. I think it's important that we think about how we got to where we are, take a look at the past, also take a look at what our trajectory may be. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not going to solve the problems for you. I'm going to try to put them in a context whereby I can explain why they're perhaps even worse than we may think they are. So what I'll be doing is summarizing some of the ideas from the chapter that I've written for this book, which is in turn kind of a summation of key ideas from my book on trade and American leadership. And I'll talk about how we got where we are now, and where we're headed. So how we got where we are. there is something called the theory of hegemonic leadership. And this is something that I was taught about in the 1980s. And what we were discussing at that time was the problem of the trading system being essentially an expression of the global distribution of power. So that we tend to view the world as being open, and there being more competition, and there being a more open market when there exists a hegemon. Why is that necessary? Why do you have to have a hegemon? Well, a hegemon is a country that has the motive and the means to supply an open market. An open market is something that, well, Dr. Krueger is quite right in saying that countries have an interest, and we should all see the benefits of an open market, and we should act accordingly. But what we find historically over time is that countries individually think it's better to cheat. And countries individually think it's better to take advantage of the opportunities for protectionism from a mercantilist perspective. Whereas if you have a country that has the motivation because it's a very efficient country, and it has the means because it's a very powerful country to supply the open market as a public good. And anyone who knows the theory of public goods knows that public goods tend to be underprovided. And in a domestic context, we say that public goods like sidewalks and national defense and clean air and this sort of thing tend to be provided by a government. We come together because there's a market failure. Markets tend not to supply to us those public goods because everyone individually has an incentive to cheat. An international public good, a global public good, like an open market, tends to be provided only when you've got some country that sees it's in its own interest to provide it and does what is necessary to bring the rest of the world around. And so we had open markets, relatively open markets, when the United Kingdom played the role of the hegemon in the 19th century. We have relatively open markets in the latter half of the 20th century when the United States plays that role. When we had that period in between, when we did not have a hegemon, we had closed markets. Well, in the 1980s, a lot of us looking at the problem thought the United States is in relative decline. We have a process of creative destruction. We have a system of uneven growth, law of uneven growth. Everyone from Thucydides to Lenin has recognized that countries tend to grow at uneven rates, and the lead country often grows slower than the challengers. So at that time, my professors were telling me we expect to see the United States turn protectionist. That expectation didn't jibe with what I was seeing in Washington at that time, but I've come over time to realize that they were just about 30 years ahead of the times. Because someone like Trump is a person who we really should have anticipated. In fact, he's a bit overdue, even if he's overdone. And so a lot of my book on trade and American leadership is trying to explain not so much why Trump arose, but why it took so long. Because in a sense, a lot of the changes that have taken place over the last 30 years can be seen as efforts on the part of the United States to adjust to its relative decline in power and wealth. Did so in two ways largely. One is by changing the basis of what we define trade policy to be about, and the introduction of new issues like intellectual property rights and investment and so forth can be seen as a reflection of shifting US interests, but also the introduction of discrimination and moving more and more towards free trade agreements rather than multilateral liberalization. So that had the tendency to postpone the reckoning that was coming. But what happened over time was there built up within the United States increasing demand for protection on the part of those who perceive themselves as the losers in the trading system. And what Donald Trump did was he identified an unfilled demand and he filled it. And so we had a very radical break, it would appear, from the past. We had a radical shift that a lot of us had been anticipating for some time. We didn't think that it would come from this person. We didn't think it would come from this party. We didn't think it would come this suddenly, but it did. So part of what I try to do in my chapter is explain how this is something that should have been anticipated, was anticipated. I then go on to describe in some detail the types of things that Trump has done, some of which are throwbacks to mercantilism as practiced in centuries past, some of which really are just throwbacks to what happened prior to the Uruguay round. So some of the grand bargains that took place in the Uruguay round are being undone by this administration. So the confrontation with China is being conducted largely under Section 301, which was a law that was utilized quite a bit by the Reagan administration in its time. And they've undone the grand bargain by which we replaced 301 with a dispute settlement body in the WTO. There are some aspects of Trump administration policy that seem like continuity with the recent past, but are more fundamentally shifting. So for example, the negotiation of free trade agreements, you can see that going back, as Dr. Krueger quite correctly points out, going back to the Reagan administration. But the difference comes in two parts. One is we used to treat free trade agreements as complements to the multilateral system. And we have gradually over time treated them more as substitutes for multilateral negotiations. And then what's fundamentally different in the Trump administration is it's not only a substitute, but it is an exclusive substitute in the sense that they want to establish, and we can see this in the renegotiation of NAFTA, the rule that not only are we going to negotiate bilaterally and not multilaterally, but we want our bilateral partners to pledge not to negotiate FTAs with China. So that's a very serious danger. On top of that, what I consider to be possibly the most dangerous thing they've done is the abuse of the national security exception, which takes advantage of the loopholes both in Section 232 of US trade law, which give the president tremendous power to restrict imports for reason of national security. And that takes advantage of a loophole in the GATT system, the National Security Article 21, which gives a country tremendous discretion to decide what is in its own national security interest. And up until recently, this has not been challenged. When a country utilizes Section 21, Article 21, it has not been challenged in dispute settlement. Now it's being challenged, and therein lies a danger because that creates a real incentive, a real opportunity for Trump finally to pull the United States altogether out of the WTO if we have an unfavorable ruling there. But lest we think that it's primarily a problem with Trump, take a look at where we may be post-Trump. And part of my argument, and this is where it really turns very unfortunate, is Trumpism may well outlive Trump. Now, we're either going to see him leave in a few months or in a few years. He's either going to be voted out of office, and if you believe the polls that we have right now, you would expect that Biden is going to win, or Trump gets a second term. Either way, we have to think about what happens when Trump has been replaced by some other president. If you take a very Pollyannish view, you'd say Trumpism ends with Trump, but the underlying conditions, the decline of American power, the confrontation with China, these are things that have been building up over time, and Trump has taken advantage of them, and I would argue he has worsened them. But if you look specifically at the positions that are adopted by Biden, there are some ways in which if we have a President Biden, we would see a fundamental break from where Trump has been. And in other ways, we'd see continuity. So the continuity would be in the confrontation with China. The continuity would be in his Build Back Better plan, which is really not fundamentally different from Buy American, Hire American. The one important difference is Biden is an institutionalist and Biden is an internationalist. So I would anticipate that a Biden administration would be rhetorically committed to multilateralism. But we have now gotten to the point where the vast majority of our trade is either with countries with which we have FTAs or with which we will have FTAs if the ones currently under negotiation are concluded. And increasingly, the WTO will be seen as the forum where we deal with China and some other countries. And to the extent that happens, I think if we have a rhetorical return to support for multilateralism, it may not be substantive. And that's where I'll conclude, which is not on a happy note.
Thank you, Kurt, for your not really optimistic perspective, but I would say we have to take it extremely seriously. And I hope later on in the discussion, we can come back to some of the points that you and of course, and the other panelists are making. Why don't we give the floor to Sebastien? Unmute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ernesto. Thanks a lot for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be participating in this panel. Let me try to give you my perspective on this, the present state of trade policy and trade wars. As a matter of fact, perhaps with a different and more European perspective, trying to think about where we are heading and whether we are going to go back to the absence of binding rules, for instance. I think on substance, I would mainly agree with Craig on the diagnostic that the present trade wars are not rooted in just the person, not only in the person of Donald Trump, but in more structural issues to begin with. And to say it in a few words, in terms specifically of trade questions, I would say, I would put forward three issues. One is that world trade has changed, and in particular comparative advantages, so that the agreement we are applying, we are living with now, seems balanced when they were negotiating to all the main trading partners, and to some of them, they do not seem balanced anymore. And I have the US in mind in particular in saying this. A second issue, structural issue, is that we are in a position where it is now extremely difficult to strike a deal between large emerging economies and advanced economies, because to some extent, rules are asymmetrical, reflecting the time they were negotiated, and which was a time when emerging economies were not central in the trading systems. They were not as powerful and as good, as competitive as they are now. The third point is that it is especially difficult to coordinate in a multipolar world. So we are really facing a very difficult problem of collective action. And in that case, I think the problem is not the large number of players, it is the number of large players. And of course, this background, this scene is dominated now by the strategic competition between the US and China. Now, this existing situation must be updated with the present pandemics, and we must think about how the COVID is changing the picture. And I think it is changing it meaningfully in several respects. To begin with, it is increasing international tensions. Secondly, I think it is likely to change behaviors for some time. And when saying this, I'm thinking both about decision makers in the private and in the public sector. And if I were to characterize the direction of change in a few words, I would say it will be a change towards more demand for protection and more demand for precaution. Pascal Lamy has been talking about precautionism, for instance, and I think it goes in that direction. Third change, a third impact, important, noticeable impact of the pandemics is the increased state involvement in economies. Due to the necessity for states to step up and protect very strongly their economies, this will change the background and the involvement of states for some time from now. And finally, and last, very important, I think, a change inherited from this crisis is, for some time, unfortunately, I fear, very grim macroeconomic prospects, and the prospects of lasting mass unemployment, a crisis of demand, some kind of heightened secular stagnation. And we all know that this kind of macroeconomic environment favors demand for protection and makes macroeconomic coordination more difficult. So that's not necessarily an issue for the multilateral trading system, but it represents an additional difficulty. So the bottom line is that the crisis, I think, is making our difficult problems even more difficult, even harder to solve. Now, when thinking about the prospects, I want to emphasize and put on the table for discussion what I see as two structurally really important issues, which have to do with geopolitical concerns on the one hand, and with climate change on the other hand. The new president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, defined her commission as a geopolitical commission, a willingness to be more geopolitical in the political definition of its mandate and the way it is used. And I think, as a matter of fact, so to say, the world is becoming more geopolitical, in the sense that geopolitical concerns are more serious and more determinant in the state of international affairs. It has always been, of course, and geopolitical issues are, of course, have always been a priority, but I think it is more visible today. It is more visible because there is not anymore this kind of hegemonic leadership that Craig was discussing just a moment ago. Visible as well because international relations are tenser. And I think this will likely last even after the next presidential election in the United States. It's also visible and directly related to trade because high-tech products are now key for military products. And I think it is increasingly difficult to separate technologies for civil use or military use, more probably than in the past. So it's not my area, my expertise to elaborate on these political determinants, but I think it's interesting to emphasize that we are already seeing the consequences for trade through the increasing importance of national security exception to begin with. The US has been the first mover in that direction, but we see that there are followers and it will be difficult to stop this trend. With the increased importance of trade sanctions as well. For the US, it's an old story, but they are widespread now more and more with secondary sanction as well. And in the case of the EU, the upward trend is striking. There were 6 countries in 1990 concerned with European economic sanctions. There are now 34 today, 34 countries. And in the case of China, it's less formal, but we see that increasingly economics and trade are used as a way to sanction some countries. The recent example of Australia is telling in that respect. And a third, I think, noteworthy economic consequence is the increasing role taken by export restrictions. In the US, it is obvious. China is as well preparing a wide-ranging law on control of sensitive products. So it is very, the fact is that disciplining great powers with conflicting geopolitical interest is really challenging for a rules-based trading system. Now, the second point I want to emphasize is climate change. On the one hand, climate change is a common challenge. So hopefully it could create new incentives to deal collectively with the world state of affairs and with this common challenge. And the Paris Agreement, to some extent, might be considered as a basis for to do that, even though it is a weak one. It is also clear, though, that the distribution of efforts to fight climate change is extremely conflictual. From a European point of view, I observe that there are forceful political demands for decisive action in fighting climate change. And as well, vocal concerns about the link between these actions and international competition. The result, I guess, is that if indeed an ambitious Green Deal is put into practice, as it should be actually, a border carbon adjustment mechanism will be part of it. And we see quite easily that this can be as well potentially quite divisive on trade as the trading system is concerned. Let me just conclude. I see through these remarks, through these issues, somehow I interpret this in relation to what some commentators have described in the past as the structural supremacy of trade law in international relations, the fact that they were given a kind of priority when dealing with international disputes. And I think this is a sign that to some extent trade is actually losing this structural supremacy in international relations. So what are the conclusions to be taken for the trading system? Well, the prospect is that it might we might find ourselves in a situation where trade law is binding only when it is not overruled by somewhat higher concerns, so to say. But at the same time, it remains a fact that international trade is probably the most direct interaction between countries. And as a result, it is both a channel and a leverage to deal with international disputes and international issues. So I think the priority to me should be to engage into some kind of damage limitation with this extremely highly valuable asset that is the rules-based multilateral trading system. And the priorities to do that would be both to fix the system's bugs, but also to find a political agreement on the key priorities. And I think the role of the state in the economy and the related disciplines, not only about state-owned enterprises, but about state coordination, subsidies, international industrial policies, should be a priority, because that is a way we can find acceptable rules to manage competition between different economic systems. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an interesting and complete, and I would say European perspective. So I think we are ready for another European perspective with André. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto. I will indeed give another European perspective. Let me first say how delighted I am to be with all of you. You were very generous to invite me once again. You had invited me to the Yale conference in 2011. I did not deliver a paper, and therefore I have no paper included in the book, and I should apologize to Patrick for this. But yet you were, generous enough to forgive me and invite me to this great panel. So yes, indeed, I think the question that I want to and that I've been asking myself, is what kind of role, what kind of posture for the European Union in this age of battle, of trade war between the US and China. Is the EU just a battleground with our large market, a battleground for the other two giants, or are we also a player? And I mean, my bottom line, I'll give you it already, is that we are both. We are a battleground, no doubt, and we can see it almost every day here in Brussels or in other places. In Washington and in Beijing. Europe is a large market that both sides are vying for, but we are also a player trying to influence the course of where the world is heading, and trying to perhaps a bit repair the system. So I would say the EU strategy in the face of this trade war between the US and China, which I agree with Craig, was in the making. I mean, any of us who are, and all of us are students of history, will have understood that the course of events was leading to some difficulties of the sort that we are witnessing at the moment, and that they go much beyond President Trump. So I think I agree with my predecessors, who sort of taking a structural view of this issue don't think that a passing of Trump will mean a passing of this of those issues. So I think we need to take them very, very seriously. And I think that Europe is indeed reflecting in this manner. It's not just sort of hoping that the election will solve the problem. There is some deep issue here. So I think the EU strategy, it seems to me, consists of three prongs. Prong number one is to strengthen its internal economic and political cohesion. Europe is a construction. Europe is not a nation state. It's a construction. And as a construction, it has always to be worried that the construction will resist both internal and external crisis. So indeed, it needs to worry at times like today, not just because of the US and China, but of the whole series of events, including the coronavirus crisis. All of this is questioning certainly some of the fundamentals. And I think what we have seen with the decision of the heads of states and government on the 21st of July of this year, on the day of the Belgian National Day, by the way, the agreement for this 750 billion recovery plan that has made the headlines both inside Europe and outside Europe. I think the plan was not only to show economic cohesion, but to show political cohesion. Yes, that the crisis has hit differently different countries, and that there needs to be some solidarity inside the EU. There's also the issue of political cohesion, and certainly the Brexit discussions, more recently the fights between Greece and Turkey. All of those have been opportunities for the EU to try to show to its member states, those that are hit most economically or politically, that there is indeed this solidarity. So I think there's no way for Europe to play a role on the global level if it can't achieve this cohesion. I think the leaders understand that very, very well. And it's not just Macron, it's not just sort of a French kind of vision, which is an old vision. I think it is a vision that is now very much shared and supported by Germany. And at the end of my presentation, I will say that Germany, I think, is indeed the key player here for the EU position. So all of this is leading in Europe to this discussion coming from France, but I think no more widely adopted of European sovereignty. And I think European sovereignty is a concept which is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think it's a concept that indeed is important in order to ensure that Europe has indeed sufficient autonomy, sufficient sovereignty to be able to be more than a battleground, to be an active player, an active, important player in this day and age. And so from that viewpoint, I support that concept. But at the same time, I'm very much aware that in some places, for some people, European sovereignty is also a word that is hiding something else, and that is hiding some protectionist tendencies, and that those protectionist tendencies today, as a result of the COVID crisis, are coming out of the woodwork more than they were present already before. So, good, but let's be careful where this is leading us. So that's the first part of the strategy. The second part of the second prong of the strategy is, what is the EU position vis-a-vis the US and China? I think there were two views. One is that we should treat China and the US from equidistant, in an equidistant manner. You know, there are positive and negative sides on both, and you know, and they are both very important players for us. And therefore, you know, we should not take sides. We should keep our distances. We should engage with both of them, but not sort of really side. They are both trying to, you know, push us around, but we will not be pushed around too much. We will affirm our sovereignty or autonomy. That's one viewpoint. The second viewpoint, or the second attitude, which I think now is coming out as the main strategy, is not to treat the two equally. And very interestingly, last week in a State of the Union speech, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, made the following statement or characterization of China. So for China, she said, China is a negotiating partner for the EU. It's an economic competitor, and it is a systemic rival. When she talked about the US, she said, we will always cherish the transatlantic alliance based on shared values and history and an unbreakable bond between our people. Clearly not the same treatment for the two partners. Now that reflects certainly the fact that, yes, indeed, you know, Europe is the Europe of values, and we have different relationship in those grounds with the US and China, but it's also a question of interest. If you look at trade, for the EU, the US accounts for nearly 20% of our exports. China accounts for 10% of our exports. Between China and the EU, by the way, the US is the #1 market for the EU. China is the #3 market for the EU. In case you wonder who is the #2 market for the EU, it is the UK. The UK accounts for 15% of total EU exports towards the rest of the world. So, you know, there is also realism on the part of the EU. It's not just a question of value. There is also an element of realism. The third prong of our strategy is indeed to act as a champion of the rules-based multilateral system. The EU cannot do that alone, obviously. The EU needs to have allies. And I think the EU feels that it does have like-minded allies, like Canada, like Japan. And when you read sort of political declarations in Europe behind the drive to have free trade agreements with Canada on the one hand and with Japan on the other, sort of recent free trade agreements, this element of like-minded countries and sort of weighing on the on sort of international affairs and the rules-based system, I think was very, very much present. So I think that indeed, yes, the EU, even though there are dissonant views in Europe, but I think by far the overwhelming view is that, yes, Europe stands behind the multilateral trading system, that the multilateral trading system needs to be reformed. And some of you have already indicated some of those reforms in a book that Petros Mavroidis and myself have written, which will be published soon, as many of you know, on China and the WTO. We also make proposals about reforms that deal with some of the issues that China is raising on state trading and others. But I think, yes, indeed, I think the EU is committed to the multilateral system, to a rules-based system, even though once in a while you do hear voices in Europe of saying that the multilateral system is for the weak, and the strong ones, they don't abide by the rule of law. Look at China, look at the US, we should do the same thing. I think those voices are very much in the minority, but they do exist. So a last word about Germany. I think in this position of the EU, many of the elements do reflect sort of long-standing views that one has heard coming out of Paris, especially about the strategic autonomy or the European sovereignty. What has struck me in the last few months, including through the coronavirus, is the fact that Germany has changed its stand and has come much closer to the traditional French view than it did before. And I think that comes out of the realization that indeed the world out there is a more dangerous world, that Germany, which is by far the largest exporter among the EU countries, Germany by itself accounts for 30% of total goods exports in the EU. So it's the export giant. Some would say too big a giant even, but it's the export giant in the EU. It's more oriented towards extra EU export than other countries. And the view in Germany 4 or 5 years ago was that, anyway, the EU is an aging grouping with low growth, that, we should orient our efforts towards, emerging markets and markets where there is fast growth. The position in Germany has become more careful on that because of the global situation, and feeling that, yes, indeed, there cannot be a strong position of Germany in the world without a strong EU. And therefore, Germany needs also to play a role in reinforcing the EU. So I think that change of attitude of Germany is really, I think, what is very much propelling the EU towards the role that I try to describe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, André, for a fascinating European perspective and hopefully a bit more optimistic. Basically, you are saying that there is still some reason left in the world, and hopefully that reason will be propelled and helped by Europe's own interests, but certainly its actions. So now we will have a few minutes, if Patrick agrees, to have some discussion among ourselves for later look at the questions, a few questions that we are receiving. I wonder if one of the panelists or Patrick want to participate now as a reaction to anybody's, and Krueger, of course, or you have to unmute. Unmute. Yeah, okay. You are. Yes, you are. Great.
Weird change in signals. Anyway, I got lots of things to say, and I know you don't want long, so I'll go quickly. I think my biggest disagreement would be with those who think that, and that would of course include political science, unfortunately, that the power is something independent of what's going on in the economy, first off, and secondly, that politics always wins. Now, I agree politics always wins in the short run, but I see the longer run trajectory as being one in which markets and politics have often and generally fought each other, in the sense that governments always want more controls and markets in general want fewer. And markets in general have been winning out over the past few centuries as we went from an East India Company, to name an early one, through various things, and as the UK and Adam Smith and Ricardo went to more free trade, and as they then grew, and then people saw that, and then that came to other countries, and the world moved away from the degree of isolation it had before. That said, there's lots more I want to say, so I'll go quickly. The second one is that if you look at the history of the world, which I'm no expert on, among other things I'm not an expert on, but in the history of the world, it seems to me that it's clear that migration used to be the big response between areas, which of course were not necessarily countries at that time, as economic conditions changed. And there were huge migratory flows in years when trade was virtually non-existent beyond a range of 20 or 25 miles. We've switched to trade as contrasted to migration, which is easier in many ways on those migrating than taking the time to adjust their economies. And I think that we have to take that into account as we go forward, especially in countries such as the EU and the US, and perhaps even Japan, where migration is a real issue. But number three is the hegemon thing. The hegemon is always a powerful nation, of course, but the powerful nation is the one that has a strong economy. And the strong economy is in part driven by the degree to which it is open to competition and to which there are incentives that work within the system and so forth. And in that sense, again, I see less sort of ability to project the political without looking at the economic as well and seeing that those proponents of the economic will increase as they perceive that they are losing out to other countries. And I think in cases like the US, yes, there has been a degree of overconfidence and also an unusual degree of isolation for reasons that I'd love to go into, but don't have time. In the US, so the one thing I will say is that we have had, I think, an insufficient social safety net. And we've had an insufficient social safety net in part because those of us who have been advocating things like free trade or virtually free trade have not been sufficiently supportive of doing more on the social safety net. And we've been too supportive of, quote, trade adjustment assistance, which has never been an adequate substitute and which increases the fears of people as change may or may not occur. But there's also a huge irrational element in it. And in the US, I see the fight as one between the internationalists and the nationalists. And that's not quite the same fight as those that has been portrayed, because the internationalists include many in the Republican Party who are more silent right now. And I think much more depends on whether the perspective in the White House shifts to internationalist than it does to the underlying sentiment, where I think if we stay in the mode we are now in with aggressive bilateralism, quite clearly US economic dynamism will decrease over time, not in 2 or 3 years, but over 10 and so on. And then the hegemon will change, but they will be the ones that are economically strong, and that will or will not be China, depending on whether the Chinese move in their state-directed direction or not. Because one of the things we know is that in this modern world, you cannot use a command and control economy very well over the variety of technical and other things you need to know to run a business well. And my final system is that even if all of those things were not exactly right, it is absolutely clear, it seems to be, that the coalition of the willing is going to win out over the longer term to get some kind of an international organization that might be a strengthened WTO, or it might be a WTO -1, that minus being the US, or some other arrangement whereby we deal with things multilaterally. It's clear to me that even if you agree with all of the allegations about China, and I don't quite, but even if you do, certainly if the US had taken an approach coordinating with Japan and with the EU, both of whom share many of the same reservations, there could have been a much more effective approach on intellectual property, on cybersecurity, and on the new issues which are important. I'd love to say more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. And if you will allow me, I would like to come back also to Craig's very stimulating approach and conclusions. First, let me clarify that when our friends speak about a book, they are speaking about a book soon to be edited, in which Bernard and I are the editors. They are referring to a book that is going to be published by Brookings soon, hopefully. And this book includes some updated versions of papers that were presented at our conference in honor of Patrick, and some new papers, including Craig's paper, where he presents brilliantly the essence of the argument he has provided today. I should say, however, that my reading of Craig's paper and argument is a little bit more optimistic, and I would say converges towards Anne's long-term vision. Because if I am remembering well, Craig, your model, the model you present, you basically are saying, well, you know, it was in the interest of the United States to build a system with rules because they felt, and they were, the hegemon. At the end of the war, the US had 50% of global GDP. I mean, they had all the military strength and all the economic power to help set the rules. And they did it with a long-term vision, saying, well, we will be better off. It will be more economical for our own power, to preserve our power and enhance our power, to have a rules-based system. Well, the next step in your model is to say, well, as the hegemon's power declines and they feel threatened by the challengers, in this case, by China, you know, the hegemon is not so willing to abide by that system, because the initial conditions have changed significantly. However, and I think you do it in the paper, if you follow through the logic of this model, then it so happens that for the challenger, and to some extent for the hegemon, is still in their interest to think of a world with rules and mechanisms to apply and abide by those rules, if they really act in their own national long-term interest, as Anne is describing. The big question is whether, you know, China is really reasoning that it will be in its interest to have a rules-based system if they really aspire to be an impressive economic power as they are becoming, and whether the United States will have the vision to realize that, you know, the unipolar moment was strictly transitory, and that it is not in the national interest of the United States, the world of anarchy, the world of confrontation, particularly when we are speaking about nuclear powers. This is not the 19th century. You go to war, see who wins, and that's it. Now, this is the end with nuclear weapons. And I read that in your model, and I think there is a convergence with what Anne is saying. The other point I want to make is really this question that the conditions for this incredibly sad episode that we have gone through with the US trade policy, it is really rooted in the failure of some circumstances that were cooking for a long time. Well, I think that's the posture of the populist demagogues. And they do and say that. Unfortunately, they are in the bad or good company of some scholars belonging to our profession, and I regret that very much. But my point is that when politicians start blaming the others, particularly the foreigners, the competitors from abroad, rather than recognizing that their system, their political will and their political actions have failed to deliver the social safety nets that they should have built a long time ago. And I'm saying this with friendship and appreciation to the United States, which is the most dramatic case. Here you have a country that still considers exotic, even a sin to speak of universal health coverage, right? Well, when you have a situation like that, the most powerful country rejecting the idea that people should have at least guaranteed access to healthcare, then we have a contradiction. But don't blame trade, don't blame Ricardo for the US not having universal health coverage. Blame political leaders that have not had the vision, the capacity, and the leader to build a system because they don't want to affect interests of entities that probably provide very interesting political financing. So I think it is our duty to put things in its proper place and not to say, oh, this is rooted in, you know, the losers of trade. This is not, I mean, this is more rooted on technology, but I would say it's more rooted in the failure of political systems to deliver, social justice and equality of economic opportunity. But I don't know, Craig, if you want to react to this, to answer my comments.
I'd be very happy to. I thank you for your comments and also Dr. Krueger. Always, whenever I speak as the political scientist among lawyers or economists, in a sense, I'm going to be the fish moving in the opposite direction. But let me try to draw a little bit of the ideas that we political scientists steal from economists, and there can be some hope for optimism there. As a general comment, Anne talked about the relationship between power and wealth. Actually, to me, a very fascinating issue. And when I lecture on these issues at European universities, one thing that I like to do is run people through the subtle distinctions that you get on that relationship when you look at what not only Smith had to say, but Cobden and Keynes and others. And I do think that fundamentally, the real contribution that Adam Smith made was to get us to understand that power and wealth are not identical, and that in fact, what is unique about wealth in contradistinction to power is that positive sum gains are possible. And herein lies, and I'm drawing here from ideas that both of you put forward, herein lies an important part of the argument that one makes to the budding or the declining hegemon, which is ultimately, yes, your power rests on your wealth, and your wealth requires that you be efficient and that you not hobble yourself with protectionism and mercantilism. And I tease those ideas a little bit out in the introductory chapters to my book. So yes, there is a basis for optimism there, but hegemony in a democracy can be difficult when we know that there's going to be losers, when we know that there tends over time to be this law of uneven growth and the sense over time that we are losing position. And when there is this process of creative destruction, which depending on where you're looking at it from, may look more like destruction than creativity. And as I say, a lot of what Trump did was he made an appeal, and an effective appeal, to the losers. We've seen politicians before him make that appeal. Certainly, Ross Perot tried it a generation earlier, but in comedy and in politics, timing is everything. And Trump managed to find a moment where, if you look very interestingly at the public opinion polling lately, there has been this divergence in which trade optimism is growing among Democrats just at a time when trade pessimism had been growing among Republicans. And Trump made the appeal to the party that in which he would be the standout because he would be the only one of 17 candidates to take the protectionist position. So what I've been arguing for some time is part of what's necessary for the United States to restore its prior position. And you have to remember that for a century, the division between our parties was on trade. It was the number one issue dividing them, and Democrats were the free traders and Republicans were the protectionists. And Democrats managed to be very effective free traders, in part because there was this belief that it served not only the wealth objectives of the United States, but the power objectives of the United States to be a leader in trade. What we need is for some Democrat to come around and be the reverse Trump, which hasn't happened yet. It did not happen in this electoral cycle, and I don't know if it will happen in the foreseeable electoral cycles. But if you had some Democrat who appealed to that growing base of the party that is in fact trade optimistic and associates themselves because they are knowledge workers, because they are people who no longer work with their hands, with their minds, and that their interests are in open markets, if someone were to do that, that would be a part of the solution. I talked about public goods earlier. We get public goods from Paul Samuelson. Let me pick up something that Anne said and also relate this back to Samuelson. Stolper-Samuelson thesis. He was telling us in the 1940s that you have to address the interests of the losers in an open market. And he was making an argument at that time that we need something like what was then developed 20 years later in the form of trade adjustment assistance. Anne says that we need to have a better social safety net. What is regrettable is over time, this has always been a partisan issue. And the advocates of the existence or expansion of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the advocates have always been Democrats and the opponents have always been Republicans. If we are going to overcome the problem that we have, we do indeed need to address the social safety net. At the start of the process, we need more money in education. At the end of the process, we need more money in re-education in trade adjustment assistance. The issue arises over the role of the United States in multilateral organizations. Could we have a WTO -1? I'll suggest to you that there's 3 different models for a WTO -1. We had the League of Nations that tried to get by without the United States and ended up having to get by without Germany and without the Soviet Union. That was a failure. We had the proposal of the International Trade Organization going forward when the US Congress made clear that it would not allow the Truman administration to join the ITO. The rest of the world wouldn't even try in 1947. For 1947 to 49 to have the ITO get off the ground, and so we had to fall back on the GATT. We have the experience of the United States pulling in and getting back in and pulling out and getting back in of UNESCO, back and forth. We've been in and out of UNESCO several times over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. UNESCO has gotten by without the United States, but let's face it, UNESCO doesn't have the same type of concrete commitments that the WTO does. My fear is that if we try to get by in a WTO -1, in which the United States is not a party, we may end up really going down the route of the League of Nations, or people will be so frustrated that it'll end up being like the ITO. One way or the other, I personally am not very optimistic about what you can do in a WTO -1. But in the end, I actually agree with a number of the points that each of you made. There's a certain limitation to how much of our argument we can make when we reduce it down to 10 minutes of the core points. But from the issue of what is the relationship between power and wealth through practical considerations like how much funding we have for TAA, these are all things that I'm sure if we had time, we would probably find more agreement than disagreement.
May I say a couple of things?
Please go ahead, Anne.
Just very quickly, what I'm talking about is clearly getting into some kind of aggressive labor retrading and so on program. I completely agree with that. I do not agree, however, that all of the isolationism here comes from what I would call even a good protectionist base. And I have in mind, for example, leaving the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, after it was negotiated, which would have included the 12 countries, the US, Japan, and so on, and instead now saying we want these new issues included, which were included in the TPP, and simultaneously achieving that Australian and Canadian and Mexican, for that matter, goods are accepted into other countries in the TPP without tariffs and without duty, and not the US. This makes no sense whatsoever, as we now then try to do it. So some of the things that are happening may be for, quote, legitimate being hurt reasons, but in fact, most of the evidence suggests that the big difficulties come in cases where there's technical change, where firms basically lose out because of that reason. Trade makes difficulties, of course, because the companies that are weaker and so on are the first to lose, but that isn't the whole issue at all. And I, by the way, also have a book coming out very shortly, in fact, next month, called International Trade, What You Need to Know, which covers many of these same issues that you're discussing. I'll stop there because I know you want to talk to others.
Yeah, thank you. Any other panelists want to have an opinion on this or another question at this point? Let me provoke Andre a little bit. You spoke about this important speech by the president of the European Commission, in which basically, I would say she revealed her own preference, ambition. And one option she spoke about, well, she offered a characterization of China, basically not very different from what the US, this government or other governments have made of China. My question is whether when you characterize China as a systemic, let's say, adversary or competitor. And at the same time, you say it is in the interest of Europe to help to rebuild the multilateral system. Isn't there a basic inconsistency? The same way, and I agree with Craig, it's hard to think of a WTO once we achieve or a new stability, a WTO without the US. Well, I think we have to think that imagining a world, a multilateral world with rules without China as a committed, engaged player. So we shouldn't perhaps be making characterizations, but try to be more practical and I would say diplomatic about it. It seems to me that the US and now Europe and others have been contributing to a self-fulfilling prophecy on China. And I think that's extremely dangerous. I think this is feeding the hardliners inside China, and this is going to make the job more difficult. But I would like to hear you more on this, Andre.
Thanks, Ernesto. So I partly agree and partly disagree. So when the EU about a year already used this characterization of China as a systemic rival, it did worry me personally. So although it was embraced often in Europe, it did worry me. It did worry me that Europe was too much tilting in one direction. The word rival or systemic was too much borrowed for my liking from the Trump vocabulary, and I thought that indeed it doesn't fit so well with the idea that Europe wants to reinforce the multilateral trading system and that China has to be on board, obviously, for that. On the other hand, the way, the sentence that I read said, it put systemic rival in number 3. It started by saying a negotiating partner. So it's a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. And the reason why the order was in that manner is because a few days before that, there had been a summit between the EU and China. And as you know, the EU, like the US, has been negotiating for several years with China on a bilateral investment treaty. And it has been viewed both by the Chinese and by the Europeans already for several years as the primary goal of the negotiation between the two partners. Many times they've put forward a date, a deadline for achieving, a positive outcome, and which was generally viewed as 2020. But we are still not there, and we are still not there because this is a tough economic negotiation, but this is also a tough political negotiation. And I think what the EU wanted to show, and I think trying to find the balance between sort of this notion of we are negotiating partner, but you are a systemic rival. So I think Europe is trying to maintain a balance between the two, and in a sense play a little bit the game that China is playing, which is realpolitik. I think China is playing a tough game, and China is defending its interests. And it's also been pushing around some of the EU countries, and this is something that has not been very well perceived in Brussels. You may have heard of this, initiative of China bringing together all of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including all of those that are EU members, plus a few applicant countries, into a grouping together with China, which originally did not have all around the table the EU institutions. that was taken very, very badly in Brussels. So it was not a China-EU, it was a relationship between China and individual countries in the east of Europe that were perhaps viewed by China as sort of politically weaker, more interested in having deals with China and sort of weighing on the EU decisions on those matters. And I think as a result of that, the EU needed to up its game a little bit and show to China that indeed we are united. You know, we want to negotiate, we want a rules-based system, but we don't want to enter into those discussions from with a weak hand. And so I think this is the way one needs to read this, including the word systemic rival. So I don't think that the EU is at all giving up on China into the system, nor into the role of the EU that it wants to assume to foster that. But it wants to show that it's not weak. It's not a weak player.
Thank you, Andre. Sebastien, you spoke, in your conclusion, you try to provide, so what's next? What do we do? And you said, well, right now, all that should be done is to limit and control damage. And you spoke about pursuing, let's say, rules of engagement or disciplines to which states as players in this game should abide. Could you say more about that idea, please? Because I think it's interesting.
Well, damage limitation, first of all, because I think we are in a situation where we have big, serious political disputes and political concerns, and I think it will be difficult to solve them with trade rules. But on the other hand, I think and really hope trade agreements and the multilateral trading system can be really useful when we have the beginning of a political agreement, and when it can be used as somehow a tool to an institution to enforce the agreement that could be found at some point. Now, I'm focusing on, and I emphasized this issue of state involvement and subsidies, industrial policies, because I think that's really at the core of the difference between the economic systems of the main big players. And we are now in a situation where I think we can take for granted that these structural differences are here to stay for some time. And it seems to me that what we would have to devise is an update of the rules so that everyone can more or less deem the rules applied as making possible a fair competition between different economic systems. And I think so far, the main feeling has been that, in particular, the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures was not fit to provide for fair competition with China in the sectors where they were to which they were giving priority, because the way they are kind of giving priority and orientation to their economy is multifaceted. And it goes through a variety of mechanisms, many of them difficult to monitor, and it made very difficult to find a good way to deal with that. And I think trying to devise rules adapted, well suited to this context where you improve transparency, notification obligations, where you balance also the disciplines on subsidy or state involvement with those on trade defense instruments, which are the other side of the coin somehow, the defensive side. I think that should be at the core of the discussion. trying to find a middle ground, and so that the solution might be acceptable by everyone.
Thank you. Well, if Patrick agrees, let's take at least a couple of questions from our audience. And if you allow me to read one to which any of you can react, says, James Flett is his name, says, if the history of the European Union integration teaches us that the solution to a crisis has been more EU, how can we get more WTO? A WTO executed with stronger institutional protections, the actual use of voting weighted on the basis of the economic importance of members, that's a question, a stronger reception of international law in municipal law. Today, one member in particular, I guess he's talking about the US, is obstructing the system. In the future, it could be any other member. What concretely can we do to stop this happening again? I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on this. Any of you? Yes?
Let me make reference to a prior book of mine. I wrote the history of the WTO in 2013. And I can tell you that one thing that ran through my research into the history of GATT and of the WTO was a very strong opposition on the part of the members to voting. So don't look to voting. Even in drafting what is essentially the charter of the WTO, spending the last year or two of the Uruguay round with a lot of lengthy negotiations over what number of votes you need to achieve this type of thing or that type of thing. The WTO calls for voting on a number of points, and as soon as the WTO members began meeting in the new organization, they immediately reinforced consensus. And even on matters on which the rules provide for voting, they fell back on consensus. So I take the point of the question, and I take the necessity of there being some sort of structural solution, but don't look for it to be voting, because there's a strong understanding on the part of all members that sovereignty is best protected when we come to agreements that have the support of consensus throughout. And consensus is very hard to achieve, and of course, in a system where we allow any one member to block action, consensus can be impossible to achieve, but voting is not the solution.
Yes, Craig, I agree with you that in normal times, it's always better to have agreement, consensus, negotiation, compromises, you know. But when there is an existential threat to an institution, to an organization, the question is whether other country members should stay on the sidelines and just see the organization becoming totally ineffectual and even destroyed. I agree with you that conflict is no good, but also allowing the WTO to become useless is also bad. And I would say that we have to make a distinction between what is the legal necessity and then, of course, the practical, the realistic power necessity. And I would say that many of these situations in which it seems that the organization is being blocked, this is not a legal necessity. The organization has legal latitude to take decisions that traditionally it has not taken because there is no consensus. But I would encourage members to be less attached to that tradition when they are dealing with an existential threat. And I think what has happened over the last year with the WTO and the attitude of the United States is really an existential threat, and there is no legal necessity to live with that existential threat, because after all, if the organization does what it has to do, then I think that will give a space for the US to reconsider what I call, frankly, abuse of power. Bernard, at some point you have to tell us stop or not.
No, I think it's good. So you've taken the questions. I don't know if there's another question still from the floor. We can go on for a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
But then we'll just close after we've done the last question.
Okay, there is somebody, in this case, no name provided, but it doesn't matter. It's equally good. It says, even if there is a problem with China that must be addressed, and even if the WTO cannot meet all concerns, what is the logic of destroying the WTO? Does this illogical stance not suggest that, in truth, long-standing trade hawks have temporarily hijacked US trade policy for other reasons? Surely the better logic would be to work with allies to use all available tools to address the China situation, including the WTO. And then I don't like to get involved in US politics, but he says, could Biden not do that? The same objective, but implemented in a more intelligent way, having recourse to all available tools? Well, I regret that Vice President Biden is not part of this panel, so he cannot answer what he would do, but maybe we can have an opinion from one of you who
Can I?
Yes, please,
Ernesto,
Sebastien.
Well, I certainly agree that it would seem more natural and more intelligent to try to build an alliance on that issue. But I just want to jump in on this discussion about whether there would be rules or not, to emphasize that in my view, it's not a binary discussion. You can, the interest of so to say, destroying the rules, present rules, also lies in what you see as a possible alternative. So a way to somehow rationalize, if it may be, the present trade policy strategy of the US administration is to see this as a way to destroy the status quo, just because it is a solution that they deem to be too beneficial to China and too bad for the US, destroy it as a possible option, as a way to prepare the ground to build another agreement. I don't believe this is a good strategy, but I believe this can be part of the story. It can be a way to understand what has been the strategy of this administration, make it impossible to apply the present rules just as a prerequisite to make it possible to agree upon new rules. I think it has failed, and I don't think it was a good strategy, but perhaps that's part of the story as well.
Thank you, thank you. Let me read another question, again from somebody who didn't provide his or her name, but it's okay. So it says, thank you to all the panelists for the very insightful presentations. This person is talking about the panelists, and that's very deserved. My question is open to any. Can the developing countries take advantage of the trade war between China and the USA and see it as an opportunity, and how? Why I don't ask Anne, you know, and was a great influence in the way in which trade policy and development was seen some years ago. She had these incredible pioneer studies, and then her work at the World Bank. So what do you think, Anne, about this opportunity?
Well, I'm worried because, for example, right now, Vietnam is benefiting from American sanctions on China because the Chinese have relocated some stuff to go through Vietnam to the US. But if I were a businessman, I would be very reluctant to invest too much in expanding capacity in those industries because the very political act that made it possible could also be changed or reversed or moved to another country. which is again a reason for the multilateral system, is because otherwise there's more uncertainty in the system. I think this happened with trade preferences in the generalized system of preference for developing countries too, where businesses very seldom took up for very much except excess capacity, because it wasn't clear how long any given country and the advanced countries would keep the preferences for them as they succeeded with their exports. And I think the same thing would be true with the developing countries. The second consideration is that to some extent, most of the developing countries have a comparative advantage in kind of the same range of goods, unskilled, labor intensive, and so on and so forth. And to that extent, if they're thinking that, okay, we'll trade among ourselves, I'll give you some of my copper in terms for some of your copper or something like that, it's not going to work too well, and it can't go too far. And once again, I think the benefits of multilateralism far outweigh it.
Thank you, Anne. Well, I think we need to close soon. So I wonder whether Patrick wants to have a final comment before we give the word to our real chairman, Bernard Hopkins, to close the session. Patrick.
Bernard, we have 2 minutes. So
Just, yeah, no problem.
I have just one remark, one question. The remark is about President Trump. I agree with he's doing policies that many other US politicians will do, but he's doing that with a way which is really extremely dangerous. It reminds me a question I raised to the German Chancellor in 1914, how the war was triggered. And the German Chancellor say, I don't even know. Suddenly the war was on. And they think really the risk that we have with this kind of the way he behaves, and he is not alone. He's now a big troop of fans behind him. And that makes me very, very worried. The second question I have, it's also a question of person. Andre, you talk about Germany. Should you not talk about Angela Merkel policies, change of policies, change of mind? I'm not sure that she will be followed by many Germans when she will finish her term. I mean, would like to have your views.
Okay, why don't we allow Andre to answer the question, and then we'll go to Bernard. Andre?
So I have, I think the question is a very good question, Patrick, and I have tested that in Germany, and what I observed is that I think that the stance of Mrs. Merkel on those issues comes not only from her, let's say, political instinct, it comes from the economic world. So if you speak to, let's say, business or business associations in Germany, they are very much on that line. So when the coronavirus crisis came, they immediately realized that Germany should not repeat the policy that it had during the financial crisis with the southern countries and imposing austerity, because they realized that indeed the world had changed out there. So it's not so much that the EU itself had changed, although Brexit, I think, has played a role, but it's more the situation outside in the world. So this strategy of relying completely on the outside world as the outlet for German production, I think that has become a much more risky proposition. So I think that German business wants to make sure that there is also an EU market out there that is able to serve as an outlet for German manufacturing, and then obviously go towards the world, but not sort of forego on the EU and just have a global strategy. That global strategy has simply become more risky today. It's pure realism. So it's not only a political vision of Mrs. Merkel, it's very much underpinned, I believe, by German business.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I think speaking on behalf of Patrick and myself, I want to thank the panelists who have done an amazing job, have leave us with many questions, but I would say also with some answers. And at the end, I want to endorse Anne's feelings that although we are bound to suffer still a lot in the short term, not least because of the tragic situation that the pandemic has imposed on us. And also, as Sebastien explained, given the macroeconomic conditions and other circumstances, it is going to be very hard to achieve the necessary international coordination. I think that at the end, I hope the national interests of every country will prevail, and they will come together to rebuild and reinforce the multilateral system that we need for this century. So Bernard, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Well, I have little to say. I want to thank all of you for participating, and just mention to the people who are listening that we have another day of sessions tomorrow, which are all on and around this particular topic. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to hopefully welcoming you all in Florence next year. The original idea was to actually do this conference face to face and do it in a much more convivial way than we're forced to do today. So let's hope that come next year, we will be able to travel again, and I will be able to see you all. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.